The bright lights in the history of American women's basketball once witnessed one of the most accomplished careers of Teresa Weatherspoon, who affirmed her position as one of the greatest point guards of the first generation of the WNBA. She was the star of the New York Liberty, the team she led to many peak seasons, most notably the journey to the WNBA Finals in 1997 and 1999, where she demonstrated an irreplaceable role as a spiritual leader. Weatherspoon was honored multiple times in the WNBA All-Star Team and also won the WNBA Defensive Player of the Year title right in the first season in 1997, a testament to her excellent defensive ability and superior tactical thinking. She was also an important part of the U.S. women's basketball team, winning the Olympic gold medal in 1988 in Seoul, contributing to building the foundation for the long-term dominance of American women's basketball on the international stage. After retiring, she was inducted into the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame and the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, affirming her legendary status in sports history. Not only was she a player, she also became a coach and a guide for the younger generation, continuing to influence women's basketball through many decades, inspiring the spirit of discipline, smart defense, and innate leadership ability. But behind those titles and glories was a long journey full of silence, where Teresa Weatherspoon had to fight non-stop to survive in a world that did not always see the value of women's basketball. She grew up in modest circumstances, where every step forward had to be traded for perseverance beyond the ordinary. And even when she reached the peak, she still faced the reality that recognition for women in sports had never been commensurate with the effort they put in. There were periods when, even competing at the highest level, she still did not receive media attention like her male colleagues, and this very silence of fame became an invisible form of pressure. However, instead of collapsing, Teresa chose to turn that silence into motivation, competing with a resilient spirit, defending every game as if it were the last game of her career, and leading her teammates with rare calmness. The pain did not come from failure, but from having to continuously prove her worth in a system that was not always fair, but that very thing forged a steel will, helping her stand firm through decades and become a symbol of quiet resilience in the history of American women's basketball. Before we move on to the next journey, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to accompany this story. It is a small way to honor a resilient journey that stood firm through the years when the world almost did not see it. She grew up in Pineland, Texas, in an environment where the voice of dreams was always drowned out by the noise of making a living. Teresa Weatherspoon's childhood was not marked by abundance or favorable conditions, but by the days when the working family had to calculate every meal, every small amount of money to sustain life. In a small town where opportunities did not come on their own, but had to be fought for with perseverance, Teresa grew up in a world where stability was a luxury. Her parents worked hard to maintain their lives, and, like many other working families in the South of America, they did not have much time to think about distant dreams. But right in that deprivation, Teresa began to form a strong inner world where she learned to observe, learned to endure, and most importantly, learned not to give up. Basketball appeared in her life not as a career choice, but as a rare escape from reality. The simple local basketball courts, the games without professional coaches, without a formal training system, only the repetition of effort and passion. In the harsh, sunny days of Texas, Teresa trained alone, shooting the ball hundreds of times just to improve one small skill, running back and forth on the old court surface, where every step was an affirmation that she did not want to be limited by circumstances. No one recorded those training sessions. No media, no audience, only prolonged silence and the sound of the ball hitting the floor echoing like the heartbeat of a dream taking shape. The lack of professional coaching made her journey even more difficult. While many other talents had access to modern training systems, Teresa had to learn everything by observation and self-adjustment. She developed the ability to read the game naturally, based on intuition and sharpness, rather than standardized curricula. That very self-reliance gradually became the foundation for her later unique playing style. Smart, patient, and never backing down under pressure. But that also meant she had to endure more, make more mistakes, and learn in solitude more than anyone in her generation. In the family, Teresa was not in a position to dream freely. Every decision was tied to reality. Every step was bound by economic circumstances. Therefore, basketball was not only a passion, but also a risky path where nothing guaranteed success. But instead of being discouraged by circumstances, she turned it into motivation. Every time she was tired, every time she failed, every time she felt she was not good enough, Teresa returned to the basketball court, where she felt she could control at least something in a life full of uncertainty. The silence in her childhood came not only from living conditions, but also from the fact that no one really saw the potential of a little girl in an unnoticed small town. There were no praises, no early recognition, only repeated perseverance in anonymity. But that very silence became the foundation for an unshakable will. Teresa learned to move forward without needing recognition. She learned to believe in herself even when no one else did. In those years, basketball gradually became the only language she truly understood. It was not just a game, but a place where she learned to face adversity, to stay calm under pressure, and to get up after every fall. Every shot, every defensive play, every run carried the accumulation of years that no one witnessed. And from those seemingly ordinary things, an extraordinary foundation was formed, preparing Teresa to step into a bigger, harsher, and much more challenging world than what her childhood had experienced. In her high school years, Teresa Weatherspoon's journey entered a new stage, where the silence no longer came from family circumstances, but from the way the world perceived her. Although she had begun to clearly demonstrate her abilities in basketball, Teresa was still not the first name mentioned when talking about young talents. At a time when sports media almost only focused on standout faces or those with ideal physiques, she was often underestimated because of her small build and playing position that did not create flashy numbers like top-scoring players. But what others saw as limitations, Teresa turned into a different kind of strength, a strength that did not lie on the stat sheet, but in the ability to control the game, and a spirit that never backed down. In the high school environment, where attention was usually given to individuals who stood out from the start, Teresa was not seen as a sure-to-succeed talent. She did not have the halo of a young star, did not have praising articles in local newspapers, and also did not have special attention from scouts in the early stages. That made every game a continuous test where she had to prove her worth not just once, but repeatedly. While many other players could make mistakes and still be seen as developing potential, Teresa did not have that luxury. Every mistake carried greater weight. Every game was a test of her very existence in the harsh competitive system. The underestimation from the outside did not stop Teresa, but it created a prolonged, invisible pressure. She had to maintain a higher-than-average performance just to be considered good enough, had to play more consistently than others just to not be left behind in the list of names that received attention. This made her youth unlike many other athletes, where development took place in an encouraging environment. For Teresa, every step forward had to be paid for with patience and effort twice, sometimes 3 times that of others. In high school games, she was often not the one scoring the most, but she was the one controlling the pace of the game, coordinating and creating stability for the whole team. However, that role was not always recognized. In the eyes of many observers, those silent contributions were not impressive enough to become headlines. This created a painful paradox. The more she contributed to the collective, the less Teresa was seen as a standout individual. The biggest pressure did not come from opponents, but from having to continuously prove that she deserved to exist at a higher level. There was no moment that allowed her to rest in recognition, no period when she could be confident that she had been fully acknowledged. Every season was a cycle starting over from the beginning, where her value was always placed in a state of needing verification. This created a special psychological layer. Teresa learned not to rely on external recognition to define herself, but on inner steadfastness. Although she was underestimated, she never let that become a reason to stop. On the contrary, the silence around her name became a quiet motivation that pushed her forward. In training sessions, when there were no stage lights or audience, Teresa continued to practice as if every day was the last opportunity to prove her worth. That perseverance did not create immediate resonance, but it built a solid foundation for the future, where when real opportunities came, she would not only be ready, but also far exceed what others had once predicted about her. Teresa's high school years were not marked by titles or early fame, but by a long process of being underestimated and self-affirming. It was in that seemingly invisible stage that a special will was formed. The will of a person who was not chosen first, but always learned to make that choice a mistake of the entire system. Entering Louisiana Tech, Teresa Weatherspoon's journey was no longer the story of a girl who was underestimated at the high school level, but became a much harsher challenge, where talent was no longer the only advantage, but discipline, endurance, and adaptability were what determined existence. Louisiana Tech was one of the strongest women's basketball programs at that time, where standards were not only high but also almost did not allow errors. Every training session had the nature of a real game. Every mistake was repeated and analyzed, and every player had to prove that they deserved every minute on the court. In that environment, Teresa quickly realized that there was no room for looseness or personal emotions, only performance, accuracy, and absolute responsibility. The intensity of training here was not only physical, but also a continuous mental test. Running sessions, repeated defensive drills, simulated game pressure situations were carried out to the point where the body was always in a state of prolonged fatigue. But for Teresa, what was scary was not the fatigue, but the fact that failure was not allowed. In that system, a small mistake could affect the position of an entire player in the lineup, and a competition between players always existed even within the team itself. No one could be absolutely safe, and that forced Teresa to maintain a high level of focus in every moment. Her role in the team was not the most prominent scorer, but the one who kept the rhythm, ensured stability and balance for the entire lineup. In a strong team, where there were many outstanding talents, Teresa became the silent pivot, the one who decided the speed of the game, adjusted the pace of attack, and ensured the defense always operated smoothly. But that very role came with an invisible pressure. She was not allowed to make mistakes. If a scorer could miss a shot and be compensated, then a point guard like Teresa did not have many second chances when losing control of the game. That made every handling of hers vital in the team's tactical structure. Throughout her time at Louisiana Tech, Teresa gradually formed a special playing mindset, the mindset of absolute responsibility. She did not just play for herself, but played as the person responsible for the entire rhythm of the team's operation. This made her always set standards for herself higher than the coach's requirements. Even in normal training sessions, she did not allow herself to be lax, because she understood that the stability of the team depended on her ability to maintain performance. That very mindset made Teresa a reliable player, but it also made her live in a state of prolonged tension that few outsiders could see. The college environment not only trained skills, but also trained psychology. Teresa had to learn to endure the pressure of big games, where every decision could change the entire season's situation. There was no space for hesitation, no time for self-doubt. And while many young players could develop an encouragement, Teresa matured in an environment that demanded near absolute perfection, that created a solid psychological shell, but at the same time placed a prolonged burden on her shoulders. Nevertheless, it was in that harsh environment that Teresa began to shape her identity more clearly. She was not the flashiest player, not the one who attracted the first glance, but the one her teammates trusted the most in important moments. Her role was not defined by points, but by the ability to keep the team from collapsing under pressure. And that very thing turned Teresa from a good player into a true leader, someone who understood that responsibility was not a temporary burden, but an inseparable part of herself in every game. Continuing to step out of the harsh college environment, Teresa Weatherspoon's journey entered a period when women's basketball had not yet truly been recognized by the world as a real sport. Before the WNBA was born and began to reshape the position of women's basketball in America, most athletes like Teresa had to compete in a system that was almost placed on the sidelines of the media. The games took place with the silence of the general audience, without the bright lights of national television, without strong interest from sports journalism, and sometimes even major achievements were only recognized within a very small scope of the basketball community. In that context, Teresa not only competed with opponents on the court, but also competed with the invisibility of herself in the eyes of society. The income of female players in this period also clearly reflected the harsh disparity. There was no salary level sufficient to ensure a comfortable life. Many athletes had to accept additional work or live as frugally as possible to continue pursuing their careers. For Teresa, basketball was never a path to wealth or material fame, but a choice stemming from pure passion. Therefore, every game was not just a professional task, but an affirmation that she still had a reason to continue existing in a sports world that was not entirely fair to women. In those years, the hardest thing was not the intensity of competition or strong opponents, but the feeling of contributing in silence. The excellent defensive plays, the accurate game coordination situations, or the moments of leading the team through pressure all happened without corresponding resonance outside. Teresa played as if every game was an important story, but the world only recorded a very small part of that story. That silence was not emptiness, but a form of prolonged pressure, where the value of effort was not fully reflected. Nevertheless, it was in that light-deprived environment that Teresa showed her true nature most clearly. She was not controlled by external recognition, but focused on perfecting her role on the court. Every game became an opportunity to maintain stability, to keep the team's spirit strong, and to prove that a player's value did not lie only in media attention. Women's basketball in the pre-WNBA era was like an incomplete stage, where people like Teresa had to create light for themselves through perseverance and responsibility. In that prolonged silence, a special will continued to be formed. Not the will of fame, but the will of persistent existence in an environment that did not always recognize you. Teresa Weatherspoon did not play to be remembered immediately, but played as if every run, every defensive play was part of something bigger than herself. And that very thing made the pre-WNBA period not a glamorous time, but a long chapter of silent sacrifice, where passion became the only motivation strong enough to keep a person continuing to walk amid the invisibility of glory. Entering the peak of her career, Teresa Weatherspoon was no longer just a mere player on the basketball court, but had become the spiritual center of the entire team, the person every eye turned to whenever the game fell into the most tense moments. In the professional playing environment, especially at New York Liberty, her role was not only defined by technique or statistics, but by the ability to maintain the spirit for the entire collective in moments when pressure seemed capable of crushing anyone. Every game for Teresa was not just a sports confrontation, but a prolonged test of leadership character, where she had to carry on her shoulders the emotional stability of the entire team. The biggest pressure did not come from opponents, but from the invisible expectations placed on the shoulders of the leader. In every important game, Teresa was the one who had to keep the rhythm, regulate emotions, and ensure that the team did not fall into chaos when the situation changed. When teammates lost their calm, she was the one who brought them back to focus. When the game became tense, she was the one who created stability. And when everything showed signs of collapsing, she was the only remaining anchor on the court. That made her role far exceed the limits of an ordinary point guard. becoming a form of spiritual responsibility almost inseparable from herself. Throughout the playing seasons, Teresa rarely allowed herself to show fatigue. Although her body could endure continuous physical pressure, although the dense playing schedule could wear down energy, she always appeared with high focus and stable energy. This was not because she was not tired, but because she understood that her fatigue was not allowed to become a burden for others. A hesitant look, a moment of loss of control, or a small delay could affect the entire rhythm of the team's operation. Therefore, Teresa learned to hide personal emotions, turn exhaustion into calmness, and turn pressure into focus. Her role on the court was not only tactical, but also psychological. In big games, where pressure from the audience, opponents, and game results weighed on every possession, Teresa was the one who kept the team from being swept up in negative emotions. She did not need to say too much, but her presence was enough to create a sense of stability for her teammates. The accurate passes, the decisive defensive plays, and the way she controlled the pace of the game all carried more of a spiritual leadership nature than pure technique. She understood that in basketball, sometimes stability was even more important than explosion. The pressure of becoming a leader did not stop on the court. It followed her into every training session, every locker room, and even the moments before and after the games. Teammates looked to her for confidence. Coaches relied on her to maintain the tactical structure, and the entire team saw her as an irreplaceable anchor. That created a continuous burden, where Teresa did not just play for herself, but played to keep the entire system operating smoothly. There was no room for personal collapse, because any fluctuation of hers could spread to the whole team. Throughout those years, Teresa gradually understood that leadership was not a position granted, but a responsibility to be shouldered every day. It had no days off, no moments allowed for public weakness, and no guarantee that every effort would be recognized commensurately. But she still continued, because the team needed her, and because she understood that her role was not just to play basketball, but to keep the collective spirit from breaking in the most difficult moments. It was that combination of skill and spirit that turned Teresa Weatherspoon into a rare form of leader in women's sports. She not only controlled the game with tactics, but also shaped its emotions. And throughout her career, that burden never lightened, but only became deeper over time, like an inseparable part of her person on the basketball court. Moving into the WNBA era, Teresa Weatherspoon's journey officially entered a new stage, where the dream of American women's basketball finally had a professional foundation to exist, but at the same time still had to face the harsh reality that recognition had never come as fully as it deserved. When the WNBA was established in the late 1990s, many people saw it as a historic turning point for women's sports, but for pioneering players like Teresa, it was not the end of difficulties, but only a transition to another form of challenge, competing in a league that was still young, lacking global attention, and having to continuously prove its own value in every game. Right from the first seasons, the WNBA was still in the process of shaping its identity, with an unstable audience and media still prioritizing men's leagues. In that context, Teresa was not only a player, but also one of the faces representing an entire generation trying to build confidence that women's basketball could exist at the highest level. But that existence was not easy at all. Every game took place under conditions where media spotlight was still limited. Every playing moment needed to be utilized to attract attention, and every player carried the pressure not only to play well, but also to help the entire league be taken more seriously. In that environment, the pressure on Teresa did not decrease compared to before, but even increased. She not only had to maintain her personal performance, but also had to become part of the collective effort to build an image for the entire league. This made every game not only carry the meaning of sports competition, but also symbolic meaning. When she stepped onto the court, she not only represented the New York Liberty, but also represented the entire future of women's basketball. That very thing created a special form of pressure, having to play excellently not only for herself, but for an entire system trying to find its footing. Income in the early period of the WNBA was still limited, clearly reflecting the reality that although the league had been born, the economic and media value of women's basketball had not yet reached a commensurate level. This made many players face difficult choices between passion and living conditions. However, for Teresa, basketball had never been just a financial issue. It was the continuation of a long journey from childhood, from unlit basketball courts, and from the years of being underestimated. Therefore, even though conditions were not ideal, she still continued to compete with an almost absolute determination, considering every game as part of a mission greater than herself. The hardest thing in this period was not the competition on the court, but the feeling of having to continuously prove value in an environment that did not fully trust its own existence. Even when achieving significant accomplishments, Teresa and her teammates still had to face questions about the sustainability of the league, about the level of public interest, and about whether their efforts would really create long-term change or not. In that disparity, she continued to play not because of certainty, but because of the belief that every game was a small step to change the world's perception. The feeling of contributing in silence became an inseparable part of this period. Not every game was widely remembered. Not every contribution was honored at the right level, but Teresa still continued to appear, continued to play, and continued to maintain the stabilizing role for the team. In the silence of stands that were not yet full, in evenings without bright media lights, she still maintained a fighting spirit, as if every game carried the weight of a finals game. And that very persistence contributed to building the foundation for the WNBA, turning the difficult early years into an indispensable part in the development history of American women's basketball. The moment that shaped Teresa Weatherspoon's name in the eyes of the public came on a night when time seemed to stand still. The 1999 WNBA Finals between the New York Liberty and the Houston Comets entered the final seconds with suffocating pressure. And as the clock neared the end, the ball was delivered to Teresa. There was no panic, no hesitation, only a strange calm from someone who had spent her whole life in moments of pressure like this. The shot from a very long distance was released amid the roar of thousands of spectators, and when the ball went into the basket, the entire arena exploded in a historic moment that American women's basketball will never forget. That moment immediately spread across sports media, becoming one of the first iconic images of the WNBA. Teresa Weatherspoon's name was mentioned on news broadcasts, in sports programs, and recognized as one of the most memorable moments in women's basketball. But along with that fame, something else began to form. Her story gradually got reduced to just that shot. In the eyes of the public, Teresa became the one who made the buzzer beater, a symbol of a single moment, rather than an athlete with a long career full of sacrifice, discipline, and quiet contributions. The irony is that while that shot was the emotional peak of the sport, it unintentionally overshadowed the entire journey behind it. The years without spotlight, the games not widely televised, the practices with no spectators, and the quiet roles in keeping the team stable all gradually faded because of that one single moment. The sports world, with its tendency to remember iconic images, unintentionally turned Teresa into a living moment, rather than a living journey. After that night, whenever her name was mentioned, people immediately thought of the game-winning shot, the image of her hands raised in the middle of the court, and the explosive cheers of the crowd. But few stopped to look deeper into the path that led to that moment. Few mentioned the pressures accumulated over many years of playing in an environment that was not fully recognized, or the mental responsibilities she had to carry in every game. An entire long career was compressed into a short segment of memory, repeated thousands of times in the media, but lacking the depth of the real person behind it. This simplification of her legacy created a quiet paradox. On one hand, Teresa was honored as a legend. On the other, her story was shortened to the point where it no longer fully reflected her true value. she was not only the one who created a historic moment, but also the one who maintained stability for a team for many years, the one who fought in a sports system that was not entirely fair, and the one who helped lay the foundation for the development of the WNBA from its earliest days. But in the eyes of the public, that complexity was often overlooked. The shot became the easiest to remember symbol, and because it was easy to remember, it gradually became the only definition. This sometimes made Teresa become a framed image, rather than a person with many layers of experience. The fame was not wrong, but it was not enough to tell the whole story. In the years that followed, every time the 1999 moment was replayed, it still brought strong emotions like the first time. But at the same time, it reminded everyone that Teresa Weatherspoon's legacy was much larger than one shot. It was a life built from perseverance, from games no one remembered, from roles that were never fully honored, and from a spirit that never stepped back throughout the long journey. And this very narrowing of public memory became a gentle but prolonged tragedy, where a legend was remembered but never seen in full. After that name-defining moment, Teresa Weatherspoon's journey entered a special state in her career. Recognized but never fully recognized, she had reached milestones that any athlete would dream of competing at the highest level of American women's basketball, becoming one of the best point guards of the first generation of the WNBA, winning Olympic gold with the national team, and leaving her mark with iconic performances in big games. But even though those achievements were clear in sports history, they were not mentioned with the frequency and level of attention comparable to male legends of the same era. In the sports world, recognition comes not only from titles, but also from how the story is retold over time. And at this point, women's basketball, even with pioneers like Teresa, has always stood in a dimmer light compared to men's basketball. Her games could be decisive. Her plays could change the course of the match, but they were rarely placed at the center of global media. This unbalanced comparison was not always stated directly, but it was always present like a silent gap between real value and the attention the world gave it. The most painful thing was not the lack of achievements, but the fact that those achievements were not fully told. Teresa Weatherspoon was not just a great player. She was an important part of the early building phase of the WNBA, the one who helped the league survive and develop in its difficult early years. But when women's basketball did not yet have the global influence of men's basketball, those contributions were often minimized in short summaries or only mentioned within the narrow scope of the professional community. That created a prolonged silence where greatness existed but did not ring loud enough in the collective memory. The comparison between men's and women's basketball in the same period also made the value of players like Teresa harder to recognize fairly. While male stars were followed by global media in every game and every season, female players had to compete in conditions with less light, less media investment, and less reach. This did not reduce the quality of play, but it directly affected the way the world remembered them. And for Teresa, that meant she always faced a paradox. The more she contributed, the less she was mentioned at the right level. Throughout her career, she never stopped contributing. Every game was proof of stability. Every season was a long chain of perseverance, and every role she took on, whether as a player or coach, carried responsibility greater than herself. But even when reaching the peak, the feeling of being undervalued still existed like an irremovable background, not because of a lack of talent, but because the recognition system never fully reflected the value of women's basketball in that period. This created a special kind of hurt, not loud, not explosive, but prolonged and quiet. Teresa Weatherspoon was not one to complain about it. She continued to play, continued to lead, continued to contribute. But in the quiet moments of her career, there remained an undeniable truth. Her greatness always came with a certain level of silence from the outside world. And that silence, repeated over many years, became an inseparable part of the story of a legend who achieved everything on the court, but did not always receive the full recognition she deserved. Throughout Teresa Weatherspoon's peak playing career, one thing was always clear, but often undervalued in the eyes of the public. She was not a player built to become a scoring star, but someone born to keep the rhythm and protect the structure of the entire team. In a sport where the spotlight usually belonged to those who scored the most points, Teresa chose a different path, the path of defense, of stability, and of contributions that did not always appear on the stat sheet. Her defensive ability was not simply reflexes or physical strength, but a combination of high-level tactical thinking and the ability to read the game. Teresa could predict the opponent's movements, cut passing lanes at the right time, and apply constant pressure that made the opponent lose their attacking rhythm. But what mattered most was that she did all of that consistently, without showing off, without needing attention. While scoring shots were often replayed many times on television, her important defensive plays often happened once and then disappeared into the flow of the game. Teresa's role on the team did not stop at defense. She was the one who kept balance for the entire playing system. When the team fell into chaos, she was the one who brought the game back to order. When the pace became too fast or too slow, she was the one who adjusted the flow of the game. That made her an invisible central axis, where all team activities tended to revolve around the stability she provided. What was special about Teresa's playing style was her absolute priority for the collective. She did not seek individual titles at all costs, did not put herself at the center of every play, and did not try to be the most outstanding person on the court. Instead, she accepted a less glamorous role, but one that was decisive for the team's structure. In many games, she was willing to make simple passes instead of trying to score if that helped the team operate more effectively. This quiet dedication lasted through each season, each game, and each high-pressure situation. It was not always immediately recognized by the audience, but those inside the team clearly understood her value. Teammates trusted Teresa's ability not because of impressive numbers, but because of the stability she brought in the most difficult moments. When the game became tense, her presence was like an anchor that helped the whole team not lose direction. However, that very playing style also made Teresa's image in the eyes of the public hard to define. While the sports world often favored players with explosive styles, high scoring, and easy highlights, foundational contributions like hers were mentioned less. This did not reduce her real value on the court, but it created a gap between true value and external recognition. Throughout her career, Teresa Weatherspoon accepted her role not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She understood that not everyone could or should become the main scorer, and a successful team needed people willing to do the quiet work. That sacrifice turned her into a true balancer, someone who not only played, but also ensured that every other part of the team could run smoothly. And even though she was not always recognized in proportion to her role, Teresa still continued to maintain that playing style until the end of her career. Because for her, true value did not lie in personal spotlight, but in whether the team could stand firm when pressure weighed on every beat of the game. After many years of playing in the role of balancer on the court, Teresa Weatherspoon's journey moved to a new chapter when she stepped away from her professional player role and turned to coaching. But this was not an abandonment of basketball, but a transformation. She did not leave the world she belonged to, but only changed her position in that world from a direct player to someone who passed on all the experience, spirit, and basketball philosophy that had been forged over decades. When stepping into the coaching role, Teresa brought not only technique or tactics, but also the entire memory of a career built from perseverance and discipline. She understood better than anyone that basketball was not just shots or defensive plays, but how a person faced pressure, failure, and responsibility. That is why her coaching method did not focus on creating standout individuals immediately, but aimed at building players with a solid mental foundation. In coaching work, Teresa particularly emphasized conveying to the younger generation the understanding that success does not come from short-term spotlight, but from the repetition of effort in silence. She often stressed that what mattered most was not the scoring moments, but the moments no one saw, moving without the ball, defending in the right position, and keeping a strong spirit when the game became difficult. These were exactly the values she had lived with throughout her playing career. Training young female players also carried a special meaning for Teresa. She clearly understood the challenges that women's basketball faced, from the lack of recognition to unequal development conditions compared to men's basketball. Therefore, in her role as a coach, she not only taught skills, but also helped young players build confidence in their own value. She wanted them to understand that they did not need to compare themselves to any other system, but needed to focus on becoming the best version of themselves in their environment. Competitive spirit was the factor Teresa always put first in the coaching process. For her, a player might not be perfect in technique, but if they had a strong competitive spirit, they could still make a big impact in the game. She often taught young players how to face pressure, how to stay calm in important moments, and how not to let failure define their own value. These lessons did not come from theory, but from her own playing life, where every game was a test of will. In the coaching environment, Teresa was no longer the one directly under playing pressure, but she carried another responsibility: the responsibility to shape the future of those who came after. Every young player she coached was not just an individual, but a part of the women's basketball legacy she had helped build. That made her coaching work deeply connective, where experience did not stop at one generation, but was passed on continuously. Even though she no longer stood on the court as a player, Teresa Weatherspoon continued to contribute to basketball in a different way. Quiet, but persistent, she still appeared at practices, still followed every step of the young players, and still put her whole heart into building a new generation that was stronger, more confident, and better prepared. And in that transition, basketball never left her, but only continued to exist in a deeper, broader form and with a clearer legacy. Entering the WNBA era, Teresa Weatherspoon's journey was not only the story of an athlete who continued to compete at a high level, but also part of a much larger struggle, the struggle for women's basketball to exist, develop, and be recognized at its true value in a sports world that was used to the dominance of men's basketball. Although the WNBA was born as a historic step forward, the reality behind it was a path full of challenges, where every game not only carried sporting meaning, but also the pressure to prove the existence of an entire system. Right from the early years of the league, the gap in media and sponsorship became a clear reality. While men's leagues received strong investment from television, advertising, and commercial contracts, women's basketball still had to struggle to keep the public's attention. WNBA games were often not broadcast as widely as other major leagues, and that sometimes caused the efforts of players like Teresa to be narrowed into a smaller scope than the real value they created on the court. In that context, every player was not only someone who competed, but also became part of the strategy to build the image for the entire league. Teresa understood this better than anyone, because she competed not only for her team, but also for the future of women's basketball. Every play, every game, every season carried a double pressure, both to achieve high performance and to help keep the WNBA continuing to exist and develop in the harsh competitive environment of professional sports. One of the biggest challenges the WNBA faced was the issue of sponsorship and operating funds. The gap in resources allocated to men's and women's basketball not only affected players' salaries, but also affected the ability to promote, organize, and expand the league's influence. This caused many athletes to compete with an almost pure spirit, where passion and responsibility for the sport became the main motivation, rather than commensurate material benefits. In that circumstance, Teresa was not only a player, but also a symbol of perseverance in an unfinished system. She continued to compete with stability, continued to hold a leadership role on the court, and continued to represent a generation of female players trying to change the world's perception. But behind every game was a reality that could not be ignored: Their contributions were often not fully reflected to the level of attention the media gave to women's basketball. Maintaining a league like the WNBA was not only a sports issue, but also a battle over social awareness. It required patience, sacrifice, and long-term commitment from those involved, from players and coaches to those behind the organization. Teresa Weatherspoon was an indispensable part of that process, not because she was the loudest, but because she was one of the most persistent, someone who always showed up and competed even when the media light was never strong enough to reflect her full value. And it was in that perseverance that her story merged into the larger story of all American women's basketball and journey that was not only about sports, but also about recognition, about fairness, and about the relentless effort to create a deserving place in the world of professional sports. After many years of quiet dedication, Teresa Weatherspoon's journey was finally recognized with historic titles. But what was special was that this recognition did not come as a media explosion moment, but came slowly and quietly, as if time had to take a very long time to truly understand her full value. When her name was honored in the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame and later the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, it was not just a ceremony of honor, but an official confirmation that what she had done throughout her career went beyond statistics and standout moments. However, unlike the honors for male stars that usually came with widespread global media attention, the recognition for Teresa carried a different tone, formal but not loud, honorable but not explosive, proud but still maintaining the characteristic quietness of women's basketball. There were no big media campaigns, no dense coverage on every sports platform, and no feeling that the world suddenly stopped to look at her. Instead, it was an accumulative recognition, coming from those who understood her journey better than from the broad public. This created a special feeling in Teresa's story, the feeling of being recognized but not completely seen in the way many other sports legends had experienced. Her career did not lack peak moments, but the recognition for those moments often came later, smaller and less loud than the real value she had created. While many athletes were elevated to global icons right during their playing period, Teresa had to wait until enough time had passed for the world to look back and reevaluate her entire journey. Nevertheless, this delay in recognition itself created a different kind of meaning for her legacy. It was not an honor that came in the blinding lights of the media, but an affirmation that came from the persistence of time. When her career was looked back on comprehensively, people did not just see a legendary shot or a few successful seasons, but saw a long process of stability, leadership, and non-stop dedication in an environment that was never easy. At the honoring ceremonies, Teresa appeared with her familiar calmness, without showing off, without seeking too much attention, just like the way she had played throughout her career. But behind that serenity was a long journey of years that were not fully recognized, games that were not given the right level of media attention, and contributions that had been minimized in public memory. The honor at this time did not change the past, but it made clearer the real value that the past had created. Teresa Weatherspoon's legacy was not built in a single moment, but formed through thousands of small moments. From practices no one witnessed, games not widely broadcast, to quiet leadership roles on the team. And when recognition finally came, it was not the beginning of fame, but the final confirmation of a value that had existed for a very long time, but was not always seen. That is why this belated recognition carried a special tone, not a complete compensation, but an acknowledgement that what Teresa had done always had value, even though the world needed a lot of time to understand it. And in the quietness of those honoring ceremonies, her legacy was not only recorded, but also deeply engraved into the history of women's basketball as proof that true value sometimes does not need to be loud to become eternal. After all the titles, historic moments, and belated honors, What remained clearest in Teresa Weatherspoon's journey was not the noise of fame, but a quiet legacy with wide and deep reach over time. Throughout her playing career and even after retirement, she was never associated with major scandals, did not create controversies that overshadowed her personal image, and did not build her name based on media showmanship. Instead, all her value was formed from stability, discipline, and the ability to maintain influence persistently in American women's basketball. What made Teresa special was not only what she did on the court, but also the way she became a role model for the young players who came after. In the new generations of athletes, many grew up with her image as a symbol of perseverance and responsibility. They not only learned from her defensive skills or her ability to control the game, but also learned from her playing attitude, from the way she always put the collective above the individual, and from the way she maintained stability in the highest pressure moments. Teresa's influence did not come explosively, but spread gradually, layer by layer, through each generation of players. In her role as coach and mentor, she continued to maintain the leadership style formed from her playing days. Teresa was not the type of leader based on a loud voice or dominance, but a leader based on reliability and consistency. Young players working with her often not only received technical instructions, but also guidance on how to think during competition, how to handle pressure, and how to maintain spirit in difficult moments. This sustainability and leadership made her influence last far beyond the scope of one team or one specific period. Teresa Weatherspoon's value did not lie in instant fame or short-term media headlines, but in the fact that she had helped build a long-term foundation for women's basketball. In a sports world that often prioritized explosive moments, her career was proof that stable and quiet contributions could also create influence just as profound. Every game she ever played, every player she ever coached, and every value she ever passed on became part of the structure of modern women's basketball development. Teresa's legacy was not created in one day, nor defined by one single moment. It was built over many continuous years, through the repetition of effort, through decisions that put the collective above the individual, and through persistence in an environment that did not always fully recognize the value of women's basketball. That very accumulation made her an indispensable part of the history of the sport's development. When looking back at the entire journey, what remained was not glamour, but sustainability. Teresa Weatherspoon represented a form of legacy that did not need noise to exist, but was strong enough to influence many future generations. And that was exactly what made her story not just the story of an athlete, but the story of how one person could shape a part of sports history through perseverance, responsibility, and influence that lasted over time. Throughout the entire journey, stretching from a small town in Texas to the peak of American women's basketball, Teresa Weatherspoon's story was not a series of loud events or dramatic collapses commonly seen in the sports world, but a long flow of resilience, discipline, and quiet dedication. When looking back at her entire career, what stood out was not only the titles, historic games, or iconic moments, but the rare consistency in the way she existed in the basketball world, always playing with full effort, always putting the team above the individual, and always maintaining calmness even when pressure was at its highest. Teresa did not experience a tragedy in the usual sense of shocking collapse or personal loss. The tragedy in her story took a different, quieter but longer-lasting form: the lack of full recognition for a very long time, the gap between real value and the level of attention the world gave her. Throughout her career, she achieved accomplishments that any athlete could be proud of, competing at the highest level, winning an Olympic medal, becoming an important part of WNBA history, and leaving an irreplaceable mark in the role of point guard. But at the same time, those contributions were not always reflected proportionally in the mainstream flow of global sports media. That very mismatch between value and recognition created a special form of tragedy. The tragedy of a great person who was not always seen in full in real time. It was not that Teresa was forgotten, But she was never placed at the center of the media spotlight like the male legends of her time. She existed in an intermediate space where greatness was recognized, but not always fully amplified. As she entered her 60s, Teresa Weatherspoon's image carried a quiet but powerful presence. There were no more arena lights, no more cheers from the crowd, but there was still an unmistakable aura of someone who had lived her whole life with basketball. That quietness was not disappearance, but transformation. From an athlete competing under constant pressure to a living symbol of perseverance and long-lasting influence. She did not need to appear loudly to be remembered, because her value had been deeply engraved into the history of women's basketball. What made Teresa's story special was not the drama, but the depth of her resilience. In a sports world where attention often focused on explosive moments, she represented a different kind of value. The value of stability, of doing one's role in thousands of small moments without needing immediate recognition. And those very moments, when looked back on over time, created an undeniable legacy. The biggest tragedy, if it could be called that, did not lie in Teresa's personal life, but in the way the world sometimes only saw part of the story instead of the entire journey. A historic shot could define public memory, but it could not tell all the years behind it. A moment could become a symbol, but it could not contain all the sacrifice, effort, and responsibility that led to that moment. Teresa Weatherspoon was clear proof of that gap between what was seen and what was truly lived. However, when enough time passed, the truth always had a way of asserting itself. Teresa's legacy no longer depended on media levels or immediate attention, but was shaped by the real influence she left for women's basketball. Young players continued to learn from her playing style, from defensive spirit, from quiet leadership, and from the way she always put the team above herself. Those values did not disappear over time, but continued to be passed on through many generations. At the age of 60, Teresa Weatherspoon was no longer the center of every game, but she had become a foundational part of an entire system. Her career was not just a story of success, but a story of how one person could shape a part of sports history through perseverance and quiet responsibility. And in the final tribute to her, the most important thing was not what the world had once missed, but what had been built and left behind. A solid, resilient legacy that continued to live in every step of the development of American women's basketball. Looking back at Teresa Weatherspoon's entire journey, the viewer cannot help but feel a deep sadness mixed with respect. Her story did not begin with glamour, but with a poor childhood in Texas, where basketball was the only way out of deprivation. She grew up in silence, having to train herself on basketball courts without lights, without professional coaching, and without any recognition from the outside. Even when entering high school and college, she was still undervalued, having to constantly prove her value in a system that did not pay much attention to female players who did not stand out from the beginning. That prolonged invisibility created a quiet tragedy, not the tragedy of failure, but the tragedy of a person who was always great but never fully seen. When entering the WNBA and reaching the peak of her career, she became a symbol with the legendary shot in 1999. But even that moment only reflected a very small part of her entire life of dedication. Most of her career consisted of games with little media light, quiet defensive roles, and the responsibility of maintaining the team's mental stability. She was not the one who scored the most points, but she was the one who kept the rhythm for the entire system to operate. The most painful thing was that even after reaching the Hall of Fame and receiving belated recognition, that honor still could not fully compensate for the years of being undervalued and rarely mentioned in mainstream sports. From her story, Americans can draw a clear lesson. The real value of a person is not always recognized immediately, and greatness sometimes exists in silence. Society often honors the moment, but overlooks the long process behind it. Teresa Weatherspoon reminds us that the people who contribute quietly, Those who do not stand in the center of the spotlight are the real foundation of all success. And in life, recognition may come late, but true value never disappears if it is built with perseverance and responsibility. If the story of Teresa Weatherspoon has touched your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel so you do not miss emotional journeys like this. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore quiet but great lives in sports.